Wang Yuan and Wang Tao were no strangers to the deep and dark world of diving. Over the years, they have dived into some of the most dangerous underwater caves, leaving behind many unforgettable adventures. But the Judon Caves in China have a way to give back like a magnet. The cave's vast chambers and winding tunnels proved to be a challenge for them, and each dive surprised them more than the previous one. Despite conquering some of the world's most famous caves, the couple felt something special about Judon. It is not only the beauty that amazes, but also the challenges. So, after a series of successful but standard dives, they decided to go ahead. Their new goal is to break the human depth record and see how far they can go with Judon. They put on their gear, check their scuba gear, and take a deep dive. They knew it was going to be bad, but what's a trip without a little risk? And they enter the darkness, ready to test the limits of their abilities in a world that is very daring. On April 18, 2014, they plunged deeper into Judon Cave than ever before, confident that their preparation and experience would keep them safe. However, what began as a thrilling adventure quickly turned into a fight for survival. The deeper they descended, the more treacherous the cave became, its icy waters and shifting pressures taking a toll on both divers. What was meant to be a record-breaking dive transformed into a desperate struggle to escape. Little did they know, the beauty of Judon's depths would soon be overshadowed by a life-threatening disaster neither of them could have anticipated. Judon Cave, situated in China's Guangxi Zhuang region, is famous for its maze of underwater tunnels and intricate rock formations. This natural marvel has attracted explorers from across the globe, lured by its beauty and mystery. Located in the remote Yuan County, an area with a modest population by Chinese standards, the cave has two main entrances, the north and south. Each leads to different sections of the cave, offering divers unique challenges. Yuan and Tao, highly experienced in their craft, were already familiar with these entrances, having each performed about 15 dives through the north entry alone. With over 400 dives to his name, Yuan held more experience than Tao, who had a commendable 200 dives under his belt. Yet this dive would push them both to their limits. Their goal was to reach depths far beyond what they had ever ventured, descending to a record-breaking 525 feet, 160 meters, beneath the surface. This depth was well beyond the 400 feet they had previously reached, and would demand immense skill, planning, and caution. Their objective wasn't just to go deep, they planned to extend the existing guide rope by an additional 33 feet, 10 meters, a feat that would involve leaving the main rope temporarily, a move fraught with risk in the dark, cold abyss. In cave diving, maintaining contact with the guide rope is crucial. The rope serves as a diver's lifeline, leading them back to safety in case visibility drops or if they lose their bearings. Losing sight of it, especially in the dim, eerie surroundings of an underwater cave, can disorient even the most skilled divers. The underwater terrain of Judon Cave can be deceiving, with many sections that look deceptively similar. It's easy to get lost, particularly if sediment clouds the water, reducing visibility even further. Knowing this, Yuan and Tao prepared meticulously for months, checking every detail of their dive plan and recalculating every variable to ensure a safe descent. One key aspect of their preparation was their breathing gas mixture. At depths as extreme as they were attempting, breathing regular air isn't an option. But as divers descend, the pressure increases, and the nitrogen in their blood becomes dangerous beyond a depth of 100 feet. At that point, the nitrogen can create a narcotic effect similar to intoxication, a dangerous impairment in a high-risk environment like cave diving. To combat this, experienced divers like Yuan and Tao breathe gas mixtures with less nitrogen, replacing it with a combination of other gases to maintain mental clarity. For extremely deep dives, such as the one they were planning, nitrogen isn't the only danger. Oxygen, which is safe to breathe up to moderate depths, can also become toxic at around 217 feet, 66 meters. Beyond this depth, the divers planned to introduce helium into their breathing mixture to reduce both nitrogen and oxygen levels. The result was a finely tuned custom gas mix that would allow them to function clearly at these record-breaking depths. The day of the dive arrived, and excitement filled the air as the two friends geared up at the north entrance of Judon Cave. They checked their equipment carefully, making sure each component was secure and in perfect working condition. Entering the chilly waters, they began their descent, slowly navigating the cave's twisting pathways and dark corridors. Their lights illuminated the intricate rock formations around them, which looked both majestic and haunting in the dim underwater haze. Gradually, they descended deeper, sticking close to the guide rope that stretched into the darkness ahead. As they passed the 400-foot mark, their previous record, they felt a mixture of exhilaration and caution. The weight of the water above pressed on them, making every movement feel slower and more deliberate. Their breathing was steady and controlled. Each inhale and exhale was measured to conserve gas. Everything seemed to be going according to plan as they approached the 525-foot mark, the depth where the guide rope ended. Here, Yuan and Tao prepared to extend the rope, a step that required them to release their grip on their lifeline temporarily. It was a move they'd rehearsed mentally countless times, but in the eerie silence of the cave, it was different. As they worked, the silence was broken by a subtle but ominous sound, a disturbance in the water. Visibility, already limited, began to diminish further as silt from the cave floor started to cloud the water around them. In an instant, their surroundings turned from an eerie, controlled environment into a chaotic blur. With the silt obscuring their vision, they struggled to see the guide rope, their once stable lifeline now lost in the murky darkness. Panic surged as they frantically searched for the rope, each second bringing a mounting sense of dread. Disoriented and surrounded by darkness, they realized how quickly things could go wrong in this unforgiving environment. Their training had prepared them for many challenges, but the reality of losing their way in an underwater cave at such depths was overwhelming. Every shadow seemed to morph into something sinister, every movement a reminder of how far they were from safety. At that moment, every decision counted. They knew that one wrong move could lead to tragedy. Desperation mingled with their instinct to survive as they fought to regain control and locate the guide rope. The minutes felt like hours as they swam in circles, trying to orient themselves in the silt-clouded water. Each breath drained their limited gas supply, reminding them that time was not on their side. The silence of the cave, once calming, now felt suffocating, amplifying their isolation in the depths. They were alone, cut off from the world, facing the silent, pressing weight of the water above them. Reaching these depths meant using different gas mixtures to keep safe from dangerous conditions like nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity, which can strike divers as they descend into darker, denser waters. Divers often switch tanks with special gas mixtures as they go deeper, avoiding the deadly effects of standard air at those extreme pressures. About a month before Yuan and Tao's dive, a renowned French cave diver, Pascal Bernabé, had extended the guide rope in Judon Cave's north entry to a depth of 525 feet. Pascal was a legend in the diving world, known for his record-breaking dives using a self-contained breathing apparatus. His impressive mark of 1,080 feet, far deeper than most divers would ever reach, had put him among the greats, even if his record wasn't officially recognized due to technical issues with documentation. For Yuan, this was a rare chance to learn from one of the best. He traveled to meet Pascal, who eagerly shared his insights, including how to plan decompression stops and manage the complex gas mixtures required for deep dives. Pascal taught Yuan to be wary not only of common risks like nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity, but also of a lesser-known condition called high-pressure nervous syndrome, or HPNS. HPNS typically affects divers at depths greater than 500 feet, where it's caused by the intense pressures involved in breathing helium-rich gas mixtures. This condition is rare but serious, bringing symptoms like tremors, involuntary shaking, drowsiness, and even changes in heart rhythm. It's complicated by the fact that helium is essential at such depths to counteract nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity, meaning that a miscalculation in the gas mixture could have dangerous effects. With Pascal's guidance, Yuan felt more prepared than ever. He planned a practice dive for himself in the clear waters of the Philippines, aiming to reach nearly 500 feet. Although Tao couldn't join him due to work commitments, Yuan went alone to test the waters, pushing his limits in a safe environment. The dive went smoothly, and he returned to China ready to finalize the plan with Tao for their big day in Judon Cave. On April 17th, just a day before the dive, Yuan, Tao, and a support diver named Zhou Pei arrived at Judon Cave. Together, they staged over 20 gas cylinders along the cave at specific depths, each filled with mixtures suited for different stages of the descent and ascent. After completing this crucial setup, they reviewed the dive plan one last time, preparing to execute it precisely. Based on their calculations, the pair estimated that it would take around 20 minutes to reach their target depth of 557 feet. They knew that once they arrived, they could only linger there for a few minutes before beginning their ascent. Any extra time at that depth would demand hours more decompression on the way back up. Yuan and Tao's decompression plan was strict, calling for 3 hours and 50 minutes of stops during the ascent to avoid decompression sickness. They meticulously calculated the gas volumes needed for this time frame, knowing that even a single extra minute at depth could throw off their calculations, risking their lives. While setting up the cylinders, they also noticed visibility in Judon Cave was unusually poor. Recent rains had stirred up silt, reducing visibility to just about 6.5 feet. In winter, visibility can be as far as 50 feet, but that day they could barely see in front of them. Nevertheless, the divers assessed the situation, confident in their familiarity with the cave and its guide rope. The wide passages would help them navigate despite the murky waters, so they decided to proceed as planned. The following day, the two friends stood at the cave's edge, ready for the record-breaking dive. Pei remained close to the surface as a safety measure, prepared to assist if needed. Yuan and Tao checked their equipment one last time, exchanged a final nod, and slid beneath the water. According to their plan, Yuan would manage the guide rope, ensuring they stayed on course, while Tao's task was to attach arrows to the rope, marking the way back to the cave's entrance. These markers were critical, helping them navigate their return in case disorientation set in. As they descended, each switch to a different gas mixture was carefully timed and executed. After several minutes, they reached 393 feet, the deepest they had ever gone together. They paused to check in with each other, Yuan signaling to Tao to confirm he was ready to descend further. Tao responded with a thumbs up, and they continued into the depths. Around 538 feet, Yuan suddenly began to feel a wave of dizziness. It was a sensation he hadn't anticipated. They had meticulously calculated their gas mixtures to avoid such symptoms. Nevertheless, his awareness was slipping, and he knew they had to begin their ascent quickly to counter the effects of the pressure. They were only about 13 feet past the guide rope, but with visibility at only 6.5 feet, even finding their way back to the main rope became a daunting task. Yuan gripped the extension of the guide rope they'd brought and attempted to lead them back to the original guide rope's position. Yuan and Tao were diving deeper and deeper into Judon Cave when suddenly Yuan's breath hitched. The guide rope was gone. He looked over at Tao, and they both instantly understood. They were in serious trouble. With visibility so low, they couldn't see much around them, so they began carefully feeling along the cave's sides, praying they'd find the rope again. Miraculously, after what felt like an eternity of groping in the dark, they stumbled upon it in the narrow tunnel. Relief washed over them, an indescribable wave of hope in a situation so bleak. But just as they caught their breath, a new crisis surfaced. Experienced divers, like Yuan and Tao, are careful with their gas supply, following what's called the rule of thirds. They use a third of their air to go in, a third to come out, and reserve the last third for emergencies. But emergencies have a way of accelerating breathing rates, depleting air far faster than planned. By the time they reconnected with the guide rope, Yuan's cylinder for that particular stage of decompression was nearly empty. With no other choice, he switched back to his main tank, filled with surface air. It seemed all right at first, but soon, at around 393 feet, he felt an involuntary tremor ripple through his body. He was running out of time. They desperately needed to reach their next set of tanks, still over 150 feet above them. Yuan believed they might just make it, until he looked over and saw that Tao was wedged under a rock. The murky water had misled him into swimming into an obstruction, trapping him. Yuan swam quickly to Tao's side to free him, but as he approached, he realized Tao wasn't struggling. Instead, Tao was signaling with his light at his neck. He was running out of air. Without hesitation, Yuan pulled his reserve respirator line and handed it to Tao, allowing him to take a desperate breath. With Tao now able to breathe again, Yuan freed him, and they began to ascend, though the panic in both was undeniable. Yuan knew his tank was already dangerously low, and now, with both of them breathing heavily, he did a quick calculation in his mind. They had only 3 or 4 minutes of air left at most. Worse, Tao was exhausted, forcing Yuan to pull him with his right arm while gripping the guide rope with his left. They still had about 300 feet to the surface, but Yuan's gauge showed they only had enough air for one of them to reach another 130 feet. In a small stroke of luck, they were just 50 feet from the next set of cylinders when, out of nowhere, Tao floated up past Yuan, rising swiftly into the dark, murky water above. Yuan's heart sank as he realized the terrifying truth. Tao was unconscious. Yuan shot up the guide rope in pursuit, frantically scanning the water around him. But the visibility was so poor, and Tao was gone, swallowed up in the shadows. Yuan knew he didn't have the air to both search for his friend and make it back to the rope safely. Desperately, he swung his light in every direction, hoping to catch a glimpse of Tao. But as he did, his own eyelids began to feel heavy. He shook his head, knowing that his life depended on reaching the next tanks, staged at the 246-foot mark. With every passing second, the tank on his back became more resistant, each breath harder than the last. With a final burst of energy, he made it to the stage tanks, swapping to a decompression mixture suited for that depth. For a moment, he felt relief, the life-giving air filling his lungs. But Tao's absence gnawed at him, and the pit of dread returned. Determined, Yuan descended along the familiar, nearly vertical section of the cave where he'd been before. But everything felt different now. His own condition was worsening rapidly, and the tank he had switched to was one he'd already partially used on the way in, meaning it was far from full. He continued to search, but his pressure gauge warned him that time was running out. Forced to ascend to the 187-foot level, Yuan grabbed the next stage tank, aware that the gas mixture inside wasn't ideal for going deeper. Desperation overrode caution as he made one last attempt to search for Tao. Yuan descended again, back toward the 300-foot mark, his heart sinking with each passing second as he came to grips with the reality of his situation. Minutes passed, and he began to feel the weight of despair, of giving up, not just on Tao but on himself. The thought of letting go, of slipping into unconsciousness, almost seemed comforting. Just then, Yuan felt himself start to lose consciousness, his mind blanking out for a second. Thankfully, he snapped back, realizing that survival was his only choice. With the last ounce of strength and determination, he ascended back up to about 170 feet. By then, all hope of finding Tao had faded. His focus shifted solely to reaching the surface, trying his best to respect the decompression stops he needed to avoid severe injury. Each stop felt like an eternity, the silence pressing in on him. But as the weight of everything that had happened became too much to bear, he abandoned the careful timing, opting instead for a rapid ascent toward the surface, where Pei, their support diver, waited. At last, a light appeared just below the surface, breaking through the darkness like a lifeline. It was Yuan, emerging from the depths, but alone. When he switched to a fresh tank and signaled to Pei that Tao was gone, Pei's face filled with horror and disbelief. Then, as if he forgot he was underwater, Pei let out a scream, the bubbles bursting around him in an intense rage. He looked at Yuan, the shock hitting him like a wall. Without a second thought, Pei rushed back down the guide rope, determined to find Tao himself. But, in a split second, he paused. Realization struck. Yuan needed help. Yuan's frequent ascents and descents had taken a heavy toll on his body. Narcosis and decompression sickness hovered over him, tightening their grip with every move. It was only getting worse, and he was barely holding on. Pei steadied Yuan, helping him to rise a little in hopes of clearing the dizziness and nausea that had overtaken him. But it was useless. Suddenly, Yuan ripped his regulator from his mouth, his body betraying him as he vomited and convulsed. They had no choice but to abandon the search for Tao and focus on reaching the surface. What should have been nearly 4 hours of careful decompression stops turned into less than 3, their urgency cutting down safety. Finally, they reached the surface, and Pei left Yuan to call for help before diving back into the water to guide him the rest of the way up. By the time Yuan broke through the surface, he was in pure agony. His legs felt like they were on fire, pain searing through every muscle. His head spun, the dizziness almost unbearable. Luckily, emergency services had arrived, and they quickly pulled him out of the water, placing him straight into an ambulance. Pei stayed back, helping the rescue divers as they arrived, all with the same grim understanding: their rescue efforts would have to wait. With the need for precise gas mixtures and volume calculations, it was impossible to go back down that same night. The next morning, April 19th, the first group of divers re-entered Judon North. They descended into the depths, searching for Tao, and eventually they found him. His lifeless body was at 167 feet. An hour later, he was back on land, brought up with the utmost care, though the silence surrounding his recovery spoke volumes. Meanwhile, Yuan lay in a decompression chamber, his body slowly adjusting. He would spend several days there, his body healing from the intense physical toll. But more than his body, his mind reeled, each moment filled with thoughts of the accident. What had gone wrong? Where did they slip? Piece by piece, Yuan began to analyze every choice and every action. By the time his treatment was over, he had come to a somber conclusion, a list of errors and oversights that had ultimately sealed Tao's fate. Looking back, everything was clear in hindsight. Yuan knew they had both put great effort and meticulous attention into planning this dive. Yet the holes they failed to close created the very environment for disaster. Yuan came to believe their biggest mistake was overconfidence. Everything had trickled down from that one flaw. The plan they had devised with such painstaking care was flawed from the start, as it aimed for a depth far greater than any they had ever reached before. Beyond their maximum depth of 400 feet, every single foot adds a new layer of danger, amplifying the risks in ways that few divers can prepare for. Yes, they had the correct gas mixtures planned for each depth. But pressure affects everyone differently, and even the best prepared mixtures can't eliminate the dangers posed by narcosis and oxygen toxicity. Yuan and Tao had pushed themselves too far, and as the depth increased, they both felt it. Their fatigue grew, and their minds grew foggy. Had everything gone smoothly, this dive might have been nothing more than a close call. But when the permanent guide rope broke, it was the final straw. According to Yuan, when they realized the rope was missing, terror filled them both. But they managed not to panic outright, which may have ultimately saved Yuan's life. Even so, their heart rate spiked, and their breathing quickened, using up their precious air supply faster. That frantic search for the rope had occupied all of their attention, yet another oversight lay waiting to deal the final blow. After Tao's body was recovered, an examination of his equipment provided more clarity. It appeared that Tao's death was likely caused by hypercapnia, carbon dioxide poisoning. When a diver's air supply dwindles, carbon dioxide can build up quickly, and the body becomes overwhelmed. By the time Tao signaled to Yuan that he was running out of air, Yuan's tanks were dangerously low as well. Sharing air had been a heroic attempt, but tragically, it wasn't necessary. Tao wasn't actually out of gas. In the chaos, Tao had simply forgotten about his second tank, which still had enough mixture to get him to the next stage. The combination of their physical exhaustion, impaired mental states, and the shock of losing the guide rope had left them vulnerable, clouding Tao's judgment to the point where he overlooked his own lifeline. As Yuan reflected, he came to a bittersweet realization. Tao had saved his life, calmly signaling his need for air instead of panicking. If Tao had succumbed to fear in that critical moment, Yuan was certain that neither of them would have survived the ordeal. That small act of courage had made the difference between one life and two.